Hey everybody, welcome back. New Take Game podcast. Excited this week to be back with Mike Stephan, my good buddy from Kansas. Mike shot a toad of a buck out in Kansas over rifle season, and we just kind of cover some tips, tactics, and what he learned over the past year on this farm. It's a new farm for him, so kind of what he learned since 2018, 2019, and what led to the biggest buck so far of his life. So awesome deer. Congrats to Mike. Hope you guys enjoy the show. And welcome back to brand new Take Aim podcast. Excited to get the show out. As always, I know it's been a minute, and I apologize for the delay in the shows. Usually we're really regular at this time of year, but nonetheless, excited to get back kind of with a bang and talk with my buddy Mike Stephan. And Mike's been on the show several times, and usually when Mike's on, it's about one or two things, filming or killing big deer. So this one is killing big deer, which is always exciting. So what's up, Mike? Happy to have you back.
Yeah, for sure. Yeah, it's been I can't believe it's already been a year, but it's been a pretty good Kansas season for me. So I'm excited to chat a little bit about how things went.
Yeah, absolutely, man. But excited to have you back. But let's kind of get into it. But first, obviously, congrats to you, man. You killed a heck of a deer. And I'm just excited to kind of hear the story and ask some questions along the way about what transpired and what details we can kind of get out of you to just become better hunters.
For sure. Yeah, I mean, this year was a little bit different because last year was the first year that I was able to hunt this property that I got permission on. And so this year I kind of stepped back a little bit because I had got already a pretty good feel for what the deer were doing and how they were using the property. I didn't do as much walking around and tried to keep my impact pretty minimal. And last year I had went in and kind of set up some tree stands in different areas that I thought would be good. And this year, I only went in and set up one tree stand that I knew I was going to hunt fairly often. But the rest of the time, I was just bouncing around, being mobile with a hang-on. Almost every hunt besides when I would sit in the stand that I had set up more permanently, almost every hunt I went in and hung the set when I went in.
So I know personally, and obviously you just stated the fact, Mike, that you just got this property last year, but overall, what was the difference between this year's and last year's game plan? Was it just taking a step back and just trying not to pressure it as much, or was there something really specific you learned about that piece of ground from going out of last year into this year that helped?
What I learned last year was that there's kind of I call it like, it's almost like it's in the center of the property. It's almost like a wagon wheel of trails, and it's kind of on a saddle between two well-used like ditches, basically, where they're crossing from kind of where they mostly bed over into another ditch that leads down to some ag fields. So my focus was mainly going to be on that central hub, which I had kind of figured out from last year that was a pretty, it was like on my cameras, it was like almost every deer on the property was coming through there at one point or another. So I tried to kind of stick to that central area, and then, like, depending on my wind, I would bounce around on the edges of the property to keep that central hub kind of from being too pressured, and try and keep those deer comfortable being in there.
So when you said bounce around, did you just kind of move a set around that hub just based on your wind, or how are you playing that?
So a few times my perfect wind on the property is basically a straight north wind. I can hunt it on a northeast or a northwest. I prefer the northeast over the northwest, but either one would work. Basically, it's a property where the deer honestly could come from any direction, so you're always going to end up giving up something. So my hopes was to give up the least amount of, the area that I would least likely see deer come in. But a few times, if I had like a south, I actually am able to access the property from the north side and hunt kind of more down in like a creek bottom area that has some pinch points. Or if I wanted to, I could just go straight through the property like I normally would to hunt my stand with a north wind. But if I had the south wind, I'd just head straight up through the middle and try and keep the wind from going into the bedding areas, and just hang a set more on the north side of that central hub where the south wind would stay out of that central hub area.
So predominantly, Mike, what's the wind you get probably the most out there?
Probably the most would be a northwest wind. So it was, if I got a northwest wind, I would be giving up one kind of ditch area that sometimes the deer would come up towards that central hub from. But what I noticed a lot of times was they would actually, they'd kind of come out of that ditch, but they'd come further east of me. And a lot of times they would not catch my wind as they came up out of that ditch because of how my wind was shooting down the middle of the ditch instead of shooting across the ditch.
Gotcha. So we have an ag or a destination ag field on one side. So lots of times for you, was this a better morning or a better evening based on, where these deer wanted to kind of come and go? Kind of notice that you saw more deer and you preferred to hunt more on those sets?
It completely depended on time of year for me. Earlier in the season, like that late October into November, things were pretty good because I would actually be catching the deer coming back from the ag fields to their bedding areas, or just bucks cruising through, checking trails and stuff. But afternoons, especially later in the year, like right now, afternoons, evenings are great because usually in the mornings the bucks usually are already in bed by the time it gets daylight. But, I mean, there's a couple times where a morning would be good too, but the afternoons definitely tend to be better because they're coming up out of their beds to head into wherever they're going to be feeding for the night.
Now, between last year and this year, Mike, as far as your agriculture, did it change? Did they do a crop rotation?
Yeah, they did do a crop rotation, and then the other thing that affected the deer movement was we had quite a bit of flooding. So there were some fields that didn't get planted. They just, they just grew up in weeds. And actually, there's a crop field to the north and east of the property that I hunt that didn't get planted, and whenever I wasn't hunting and I just wanted to go check ag fields for deer, it's crazy. That field that didn't have any crops in it, it was just growed up in weeds and stuff, has had a lot of deer in it almost every night. I mean, tons of does, some good bucks coming out into it, and I don't know for sure what it is they're eating, but it must be whatever kind of green leafy weeds are growing up in the field that didn't get planted. So I think that had a big effect on the deer movement as well. Seemed like I didn't see as many deer this year as I did last year, and I think it's because they were spread out further, and they were using some of those fields to the north. Also, those fields to the north, almost right after they harvested those fields, they went in and dissed them under. So that pretty much, made those fields not a primary food source for the deer. So it pushed the deer further back in the timber where I hunt. So I think that's another reason why I saw a lot more deer last year versus this year. Those fields to the north, only a few of them got dissed under. The other ones are still just cut beans. So the deer are still using those north fields quite a bit for force.
So you basically had the exact same opposite effect from year to year.
Yeah, exactly. So next year, hopefully it will be more like it was last year for me, and those ag fields to the north get dissed under right away and pushes those deer back towards me further.
Yeah, it's really hard. I think we take it for granted on some pieces of property when you don't have a food source. And, just conversation-wise, I was just discussing this with a buddy of mine that we have a lease down in southern Indiana, and they went down and hunted this past weekend, and we had crop fields in the bottom, and it was the same thing, Mike. This is the only food for miles, probably 3 miles, and that bottom field was washed out, so we had no food this year. And obviously, because of my torn bicep, I didn't make it down to hunt down there, but they went down, so I was just, conversation-wise trying to figure out what's going on and what the deer are doing. And, it is amazing to me that once that food's gone, what it does to the deer and how they will disperse and just go further and go further and go further until they find that preferred food source. But I think it's something to really take away from, a conversation like this, because it keeps coming up. And then I think it's a really easy thing to overlook is that food source. And I think we just sometimes take it for granted how powerful it is.
Yeah, it completely changes the deer movement, no doubt. And even year to year with the crop rotation, earlier in the year, the beans are more sought after by the deer. And then as the season progresses, they start getting into those cornfields a little bit more. And when you have that crop rotation and those fields change from year to year, you're going to see the deer movement change.
Yeah, for sure. It's quite a bit. So, yeah, that's crazy to think that you guys had so much rain out there that it washed out your crop fields. It's, it's like one of those things, there's nothing you can do about it at the time, but, you have to keep hunting and just try to adapt and figure out what they're doing. And it sounds like you're pretty much on the path. So from that being said, the crop time to like the start of hunting season, Mike, where did it change for you, and when did you really kind of start diving in to get on one or two of these hitless deer you were after?
There's been a couple deer that I've had pictures of from last year that I was pretty interested in. And it was actually very similar to last year, where I was getting a few bucks early in the season, August, September, and a few new bucks that I'd never seen before, but I got those pictures of them in velvet, and then they just completely disappeared. But then there's, the core bucks that are hanging out still in the area, and then some of the bigger deer that I was interested in, they didn't really show up on camera until mid to late October, which is exactly the same thing that happened last year. So I know those deer live, somewhat close in the area, but it seems like they tend to really not venture out much from their core area. So I don't know if some of those bucks are hitting those bean fields early, late summer, or if they really are not even coming out of the woods and they're just browsing on what they have close to their bedding areas. And then obviously as soon as the acorns start dropping, I'm sure they hammer those. So it's been interesting to see that some of the more mature deer just don't even come out into the ag field, at least early on. I've only seen, the deer that I killed this year, I saw in a bean field late summer last year. And that's the only mature deer that I've actually seen out in one of the fields early on in the season or even late summer.
One thing I'd contribute to that, and maybe it's just craziness, I think there's a rule and always an exception to the rule. And one thing I've always noticed, Mike, is I believe that a lot of those deer are a little bit more relevant in some of those crop fields like that when it's secluded, like completely, like it's hid from the road, meaning that, either the topography or it's closed off on two sides from the road, something like that. I think a lot of those road-facing fields, a lot of those big deer have just learned over time, not saying they won't do it, I just think it's far and few between, that they've just learned over time to kind of stay away from some of those roads and stay away from that human traffic. And I just think a lot more deer are visible, like I said, on some of those bean fields, late summer, when people go to glass, if you can focus on a spot that's kind of hid from the road or any kind of access from humans, it just seems to me that's where they are sometimes.
Yeah, I completely agree. It's actually, so last year when this field was in beans and I got the video of the buck I ended up killing this year, so the bean field against the timber that I hunt, and then in front of the bean field was a cornfield, and then there was the road. So the cornfield actually acted as a barrier for that back bean field, and I think that's why I saw him come out into that bean field, was because he felt more secure. He was hidden away from the road, and the only reason I was able to see him was the road actually goes up a hill, and if you get set up correctly, you can see back into the bean field from the top of that hill.
Yeah, very cool. Yeah, it just seems to me that's a good trick that works. If you can find one of those spots and kind of sneak in on them without being too close in on them and give them their space like that, you can kind of get some really good, early to late season or summer, I should call it, scouting in that way.
For sure. Yep.
So bow hunting wise, Mike, what happened, during the bow hunting archery season for you? Did you kind of, get an opportunity or near or far or see some of those target bucks, or was it just timing, so to speak, or did you lose them during the rut, or what happened on some of those hunts?
My my target bucks were mostly either not around or, I'd catch a few nighttime photos of them. So I was hunting, I hunted a little more this year than I did last year, just because schedule-wise I was able to. So I hunted in some of the prime times, early November, mid-November, and into late November. And it's always been, at least for me in the part of Kansas I'm in, it always seems to be a lot better seeing big mature deer later, mid to late November. That early November, just either those deer aren't ready to start chasing yet, or I think what happens is actually some of those bigger mature deer, they know which does are going to start coming in, early, and they key in on those doe groups, and those mature bucks will go in and actually just lock down a doe and just keep hitting those doe groups that are coming in, and they'll just keep locking down does. And the reason, we're not seeing the chasing action until later in the season is a lot of those does have already been bred mid to late November, and those bucks are trying to find the last few that are available. So I had some really good, I think November 7th, which is, that magical day that everybody talks about. I had a really good morning, saw a lot of bucks. I think I saw like 9 different bucks, and got to watch a couple bucks fight, like 40 yards from my tree stand, which was awesome. But none of those bucks were on my target list. And as cool as it is to see all that action, it sucks when you're not seeing the big mature ones that you're after. But then, later, mid to late November, things started heating up a little bit. I started seeing some of those more mature deer kind of cruising through, checking trails, checking doe bedding. And this year I decided that when the rifle season came in Kansas, that I was going to go ahead and pick up the rifle and, see what was going to happen. I love bow hunting, but I'm not afraid to pick up the rifle, especially with the luck I was having. I figured if I did have an opportunity at one of those mature bucks, I needed to capitalize on it. And, with it being starting to get later in the year, and I know coming up I won't have a lot of extra time to be hunting, that advantage of having the rifle in hand was going to probably be the way to go.
Yeah, for sure. And for people that don't know, like your guys' rifle season in Kansas, I mean, it's really late. Like we're talking, correct me, Mike, so I'm sure the day changes a little bit, but it's like the last day or two of November, correct?
Yeah, so it's actually the technical, the date changes every year, but it's the first Wednesday after Thanksgiving is when it starts.
First Wednesday after that. That's a pretty good one right there.
Yeah, and so this year it was really late because the Thanksgiving was way late. It was like the 28th or something. So it was into December before the rifle season started. And I will say the one thing that you will run into with that late rifle season is that secondary rut at the beginning of December. You actually do see some of those more mature bucks kind of show up, checking some of those food source areas. They're coming in really late, but they're still coming in and checking some of those does. But also they're kind of 50-50 on their mind being on food, but also if they happen to be in there and one of those does is coming in, they'll switch gears and start bumping her around. So that's the kind of the saving grace for the rifle season is you get a little bit of both actions as far as them coming back to the food sources, but also you might catch them bumping does or chasing even a little.
Yeah, that is cool, especially out, like where you are. That just seems to be a natural, part of the process out there, where ours is really done kind of 2 weeks before that, and on top of that, it's 2 weeks of gun season, so we don't get that kind of activity as far as deer wise. Deer aren't coming back to food because they're scared shitless still of 2 weeks of Michigan gun. But for you guys, like you said earlier in the story, Mike, that a lot of your deer hunting doesn't even pick up till mid-November and the third week. So that is kind of neat. Like you said, it kind of gives you the best of both worlds late November like that, which is really, really cool.
Yeah, for sure. It's crazy how everybody you see that November 7th and that first 2 weeks of November, everybody's super excited about, and it just isn't not very often does it get really going here until the second, third, even into the fourth week of November.
Yeah, that is wild, but super cool though, and it makes kind of the harder part of, if you ask me, hunting season, when it starts to get brutally cold every day, it's in the 20s or lower, that it gives you something really to look forward to because the deer movement isn't killed yet.
Yeah, for sure.
So you're at gun season. You have a couple of these deer that you're trying to get after. So what happened actually, on this hunt that we're going to talk about your deer?
Yeah, so I went in actually, I think it was the day before or 2 days before I killed, and hung a stand in a spot that I thought was going to be, within 100 yards or so of where I was seeing most of the deer crossing through. And there was really one specific buck that I've been after most of the year. He's a really good deer. He's actually a deer that I was kind of chasing last year too. But there were a couple on other bucks on the list that I would be interested in, and a lot of that is those decisions on those hit list bucks, or if you will, are made when you see them in person. Sometimes those trail cam pics can be a little deceiving, either make a buck look bigger than it is or even make a buck look smaller. But with this year, I had the buck that I ended up killing, that Big 10, I hadn't had him on camera for over a month. He hadn't been in the area. I think he was kind of sticking more to the north where A lot of those doe groups were still feeding in those fields to the north that they didn't have last year but did have this year. So then, yeah, it was honestly the last year I was expecting to walk out into the area that they crossed. So I actually watched him for a little while because there was there's a more mature deer that was like an 8-pointer, but he was kind of busted up, and he was hanging out there, and there was a little yearling that he was kind of bumping around, and then the buck that I killed came up out of the bedding area, and they kind of circled each other for a while. I got to watch that. Didn't have very many opportunities, a clear shot, because they kept circling each other, and you could tell the buck that I killed was actually a more submissive deer. He didn't really want anything to do with that other deer. And then the big 10 I killed, he started moving closer to my tree stand, kind of off to my east, and I had kind of a northwest wind, so I knew he was eventually going to pick up my scent the direction he was headed. And I was still sitting down in my stand, and I had to stand up and turn, and luckily he was kind of facing the other direction when I did that, so he had no idea. I just pulled the gun up, and he was like 50 yards away with that 30-30. It was no problem. When I pulled the scope up, I didn't have a shot, but then he kind of opened up broadside, and it was a little bit quartering away, so I got a pretty good right behind the shoulder and full pass-through, obviously with 30-30 at 50 yards, and he actually ran towards my stand and ran under my stand after I shot, and he died probably 40, 50 yards away from my stand, just on the opposite side of my stand from where he was at. And it was crazy because like I said, he was the last deer I was expecting to walk out, and when you see that deer on the hoof, he's just a really impressive deer. He's got those real tall tines and big frame. He's a very impressive deer on the hoof.
Yeah, he's an awesome deer, man, and congrats again. And what I think is so cool and is what you said earlier is a great way to put it, is some of those hit lister bucks, you know they're good, but it's when you see them in person it really makes up your mind. And some of that is, man, it could be a much better deer than you even imagined. Or for you, Mike, you got a wall full of great Kansas deer, and this is probably one of those deer that is still right at the top of your list for the ones you've killed. That's how good he is. And, probably like you said, when you saw him in person, you saw that frame on that deer, you're like, there's just no way you can't kill a deer like that.
Yeah, he's such an impressive deer in person. Just the frame and the tine length and everything. When he walked, because I had actually seen this deer last year in time, and again, when I saw him, I was just amazed at how big his frame was, and I actually slung an arrow at him at 40 yards, and he ducked my arrow last year, and I hadn't seen that deer, in person again until this year when I killed him. He's just a very impressive deer, and he is in fact the biggest deer that I've killed so far.
Yeah, it's amazing. Yeah, super awesome, and unique story, that backstory too, that you had an encounter with him last year and missed, and makes it even more crazy that you hadn't seen that deer this year. I mean, what's the odds of both those things happening? It's pretty wild.
Yeah, it's crazy. It's definitely a cool story, and that's a lot of times that's what makes a deer, more special to you than anything, is just the history with that deer and the story behind it. Even though he's a really big deer, it's also really cool to have that history with him.
Yeah, for sure. I agree 100%. And that's exactly what makes it unique to all of us, is that whatever encounters we've had usually, in the past. And yeah, just super cool story. And it's cool too that you legitly shot it with maybe the first style of deer rifle known to deer hunters, the awesome lever action 30-30, which I think is super cool too.
Yeah, that gun, a little bit of a backstory on that. So I don't remember how long ago it's been now, but my parents' house actually got broke into when I was younger, and all of my dad's guns were stolen. He had I don't remember, 9 or 10 different guns, and some guns were passed down from his dad, some double barrel shotguns and stuff, and pretty crappy deal. So that was right before I started getting into hunting. And so with that happening, my dad and I had to go get, new guns. And his original deer rifle was a 243, but then what we decided finally, since we're here in Kansas and we hunt in a lot of brush and stuff, we're typically not taking shots over 150 yards. The 30-30s are we actually kind of settled on, and so that's what we ended up going with, was those lever action 30-30s, and so that we've been deer hunting with since I started deer hunting. And it was cool to pick up his rifle and take it into the woods and be able to kill this deer with it.
Yeah, it is neat. And like I said, at least throughout the Midwest, and and I don't know, obviously not maybe in Texas or something like that, but it just seems like that was the first, real deer hunting gun. And matter of fact, I shot my first deer ever way up north with a Marlin 30-30 as well, lever action. And yeah, just super cool. Kind of makes me smile when I see those around still. It's such a cool gun.
Yeah, I absolutely love that gun. And you're probably not going to take shots over 200 yards at anything with them, just because they're not a really, high performance speed gun. But they do have plenty of knockdown power, especially within that 100-yard range. And they're a fun gun to shoot. The lever action's fun. It's different than a bolt gun, so it's kind of, I guess, a little more Western, if you will, which it makes it a lot of fun to rack around in. And yeah, I agree. It's definitely one of the original kind of deer hunting rifles that was used.
Yeah, the lever action makes it pretty special, and the shorter barrel, just it like you said, it's a great brush gun, so to speak, and they do have great knockdown power, and just all around it's a great gun. Besides the fact that like you said, you're not going to reach out and shoot something at 300, 400, or 500 yards. But besides that, it has a lot of great benefits to it, and very capable of being still is one of the best deer hunting guns ever. So that's really cool. And yeah, really cool backstory, Mike, too, with that gun and how that came about as well. It's pretty wild.
Yeah. It may not be a real old gun that was passed down, but I guess you could say that my dad and I are the beginning of the passed down stage.
Yeah, for sure. Yeah, absolutely. So, well, man, I'm always excited when one of my buddies kills one, and Mike's really one of my very close buddies, and I always get pumped when he kills one, because I've hunted with Mike out in Kansas and some of that ground, and just unique to see Mike, achieve and just kind of realize how great it is out there. And he's held a great standard for a lot of these deer he's killed out there, and just always super proud of you, Mike. I think it's awesome deer, and knock on wood, next year we'll be talking about it, one as good or better even.
Yeah, definitely. That would be pretty awesome. So we'll just have to see what next year brings. I've still got some really good deer on camera that are going to most likely make it. The rifle season ends here on Sunday, and here in a couple days, and generally after that, the deer don't get hunted a lot, and particularly in the area that I'm in, they pretty much get left alone. So have high hopes for the survival of some of my other big mature deer that I've got some pictures of.
Yeah, for sure. I know that like you said, that area. I mean, it's known for producing some good deer, and part of that is, like that lack of pressure in that late season is so important for deer coming into the following year. So hopefully, come shed season, you'll get on some more good information about what some of those deer are doing, and obviously going in year 3 on a new piece of property, man, you should be like really in the driver's seat by then, which is super exciting. It sounds like you already are, but every day and every hunt and every time you shed hunt it, it just gets better and better.
Oh yeah, that was one thing for sure too. Was this past spring when I got to go out and spend a lot more time walking around and picking up sheds and stuff. I actually did pretty well this year finding sheds, and it absolutely changed my whole perspective on the property and where some of these deer are bedding and how they're using the area. So it gave me a much better feel for the property and was was able to kind of educate me and get me to make the decisions I made on where I would want to hunt. So that, I guess, would be a really good tip for some people, especially if they're on a new property, but even if they're hunting, their family farm that they've hunted forever, is to get out there and really walk the property and wherever you're going to find those sheds, if you find them in some of their bedding areas, it's pretty amazing some of the areas that those bucks decide that's where they're going to spend most of their time. So, definitely get out there and walk your property. It makes a huge difference.
Yeah, for sure. And before I let you go, Mike, one question real quick is, based on that intel from shed season, how far would you say that circle hub was that you hunted quite a bit from, like, some of those bedding areas, yardage-wise? I'm just curious.
It probably ranges anywhere from 100 to 300 or 400 yards from some of the bedding areas.
Okay.
Some of those deer bed really close to that hub, and it obviously changes day to day. They kind of, there are core bedding areas, but what I've noticed is deer tend to, well, at least the younger deer will just bed anywhere that they feel like bedding. As long as it's a comfortable area, they, feel safe in that spot. So I know the more mature deer, they tend to kind of stick to their core bedding areas and have the wind in their favor and everything else. But I did notice a lot this year that a lot of those younger deer and younger bucks just kind of plop down wherever is comfortable for them.
Yeah, they do, for sure. That is a very good point. But yeah, I was just curious about that, or what you had found, and and that kind of makes a difference between coming into a certain spot that you can hunt multiple times over and over, is how close you can get to that bedding area. But that sounds like you had just enough buffer right there that you could hunt it quite a bit, which is great.
Yeah, for sure. And I always very good tabs on the wind direction, obviously, when I went in there. And every time I would go in, I would spray down my boots, like soak them in a cover scent, or a scent eliminator. I don't know how well that stuff works, but if I just absolutely drenched my boots in a scent eliminator and walked in, I had a lot of deer walk over my path in and even follow my path in and never spooked because of that. So I don't know, like I said, I don't know all the science behind the scent elimination, but more do it just because if I didn't do it, I'd feel
a little naked.
Yeah, I feel naked not doing it. So I don't know how well that works, but it worked for me as far as keeping my in and out, from getting too covered in scent and really having those deer key in on you coming in and out of there.
Yeah, for sure. No, that's huge, man. Absolutely huge. But as we close out, Mike, let everybody know one more time where they can find you. Mike's always up to something really cool and on his social media, so let everybody know where they can find you. And hopefully, like I said, next year, Mike, we're doing this again.
Yeah, for sure. Facebook, just Mike Stephan, last name's Stephan, and Instagram, Bear Ridge Mike. My company name is Bear Ridge Media, so you can do a Google search or Facebook or Instagram search for those, and should be able to pop me up.
Absolutely. And thanks again, Mike. Congrats on a great deer. And everybody, you'll catch us next week. Outdoor Podcast channel, iTunes, Unfiltered Outdoors app. We'll see you guys soon.